Laelius on Friendship by Marcus Tullius Cicero, translated into English from Latin by Michael Grant. Quintus Mucius Scaevola the augur used to call on his abundant memory to tell many excellent stories about his father-in-law, Gaius Laelius, and whenever he mentioned him, he invariably spoke of Laelius the Wise. After I had grown up, my father took me to Scaevola. His idea was that, as far as I could manage it, and as far as he would let me, I should never be out of the old man's company. Scaevola used to talk about a wide range of subjects, with great wisdom and a wealth of terse, apt comments. I made a practice of committing every one of them to memory, since I believed his legal learning would provide a very useful addition to my own knowledge. When he died, I transferred my attentions to Quintus Mucius Scaevola the priest, whom I would call the most able and upright man in the whole country. But I shall speak of him on another occasion. Now I want to return to Scaevola the augur. I remember a great many of the talks we had together, but clearest of all is my recollection of a day at his home. He was sitting in his garden, as he often used to do, in a semicircular arbor. The only other people there besides myself were a few other close friends of his. Scaevola hit upon a topic which, at just about that time, was on many people's lips. You yourself, Atticus, were seeing a good deal of Publius Sulpicius Rufus in those days, and I am sure you recall what happened. Sulpicius, who was a tribune at the time, had become a deadly enemy of Quintus Pompeius Rufus after being his most intimate and affectionate friend, and everybody was surprised and sorry. On this occasion, Scaevola happened to mention the matter, and then he went on to tell us of a discourse on the subject of friendship, which Laelius had pronounced to himself and another man who, like Scaevola, was Laelius's son-in-law, Gaius Fannius, the son of Marcus. This happened a few days after the death of Scipio Africanus the Younger. I memorized the main points of what Laelius said, and now, after my own fashion, I have set them down in this book. I have done so by bringing the actors onto the stage to speak for themselves. My intention was to avoid constant interruptions of I said and he said, since I wanted to make it seem as if they were actually in our company and talking to us themselves. You have often asked me to write something about friendship, and the subject is one which appeals to me deeply. Friendship is something everyone ought to think about, and the theme is particularly appropriate to people who are such close friends as you and I are. For these reasons, I warmly welcomed your suggestion. And I do venture to hope that this volume, which has emerged as a result, will be useful not only to yourself, but to others as well. When, at your request, I wrote my Cato the Elder on old age, I made Cato himself, as a very old man, the principal speaker. He seemed to me the most suitable person I could think of to talk about that period of life, since it was years and years since he had been anything but old, and he had prospered more than anyone else of similar age. As regards my present subject, however, we have heard from our elders that the friendship which Gaius Laelius enjoyed with the younger Scipio Africanus was outstandingly memorable. It therefore seemed to me that Laelius was the appropriate character to deliver his opinions about friendship, and indeed, according to the recollections of Scaevola, he actually had spoken on the subject. Somehow expositions of this kind seem to carry special conviction when they are placed in the mouths of personages of an earlier generation, especially when these were eminent men. For example, when I read my own treatise on old age, it sometimes affects me so profoundly that I actually feel it is Cato who is doing the talking, and not myself. In that book, I was writing on the subject as one old man to another. And now, in accordance with the same procedure, I am writing about friendship as between friends. In my earlier work, as I said, the speaker was Cato, who lived to almost as great an age as anybody else at that time, and was inferior to none of them in talent. Laelius, my present spokesman, was another man of exceptional wisdom. Indeed, he was famous for this, but he also provided a conspicuous example of my present theme of friendship. So I ask you to dismiss myself altogether from your mind for the time being, and to imagine that it is Laelius who is speaking. At the time we are thinking of, Africanus is just dead, and Gaius Fannius and Scaevola the augur have come to see their father-in-law Laelius. The two visitors start a conversation, and Laelius is going to reply. He will devote the whole of his discourse to friendship. Read what he says, and you will recognize yourself. Here begins the discourse. Fannius. When you say, Laelius, that a finer and more illustrious man than Africanus never existed, you are perfectly right. All the same, you must realize that the person towards whom everyone's eyes are now turned is yourself. People call you the wise, and they do so from profound conviction. Not long ago, that is what they used to call Cato, and we know that Lucius Acilius was similarly described in our father's time. But they were awarded the title for rather different reasons. Achilles earned it because of his renown as an expert in the law, and Cato because of his wide-ranging experience and the shrewd foresight, resolution, and oratorical skill he had so conspicuously displayed in Senate, House, and Forum alike. As a result, by the time he was an old man, the designation wise had almost become part of his personal name. When you are given the same title, on the other hand, it possesses a rather different significance. For in your case, the compliment refers to a wide range of different qualities that you possess. Natural talent, character, industriousness, and learning all play a part. Besides, this term is not applied to you by any means loosely, in the way that ignorant people employ it, but in the accurate sense in which erudite scholars use the word. I am thinking of the strict type of definition maintained by authorities who are such severe critics that they are not even prepared to admit that the 7 sages themselves deserve inclusion among truly wise men. According to this view of the matter, there has never been a wise man in the whole history of Greece, with the single exception of that one individual at Athens who was specifically declared to be the wisest of men by the oracle of Apollo himself. Nevertheless, you too are generally believed to be wise. This is because of your firm belief that your entire well-being depends upon yourself and yourself alone, and that all human vicissitudes are insignificant, since the only thing that matters is whether a man is morally good or bad. That is why I am always being asked, and the same inquiry I understand is addressed to Scaevola as well, how the death of Africanus is affecting you. The inquiries have become particularly insistent because on the nones of last month, when we met at Decimus Brutus's country house for our usual discussion of matters concerning the augurs, you did not join us. This attracted attention, because you have always been so very meticulous in your attendance on these occasions, as indeed in all your other augural duties. Scaevola. I too have noted that there has been curiosity about your reaction to Africanus's death, but when I am asked about this, I always answer, Laelius, what I have seen with my own eyes, that although you have lost a very great friend, who was also a very great man, you are enduring your grief with composure. It could not be expected, I go on to point out to them, that your loss would leave you unmoved. You have too warm a heart for that. But your absence from the meeting of our association on the nones, I assure them, was due to the fact that you were unwell, and not because you were mourning. Laelius. Quite right, Scaevola. What you told them was perfectly accurate. Whenever I am in good health, I have always fulfilled the obligations you mentioned, and I would never have allowed any question of personal convenience to keep me away from them. Indeed, in my view, no man with the slightest sense of responsibility would allow himself to be deflected by considerations of such a kind from the performance of any of his duties whatsoever. Now, Phanius, when you tell me that I am being paid these compliments, I feel quite unable to accept them, nor, of course, did I ask for them, though it is very kind of you. When you speak of Cato, however, I do not think your estimate does him justice. It may well be, certainly, that no such thing as a wise man has ever existed, and I am inclined to believe that this is the correct view. But if there ever has been one, Cato is the man. Even if we leave all other evidence to one side, think how he took the death of his son. I remember when Paulus suffered a similar loss, and I myself saw Gallus when he, too, was bereaved. But the sons they lost were only boys, whereas Cato's was a grown man who had already revealed his gifts. So I myself feel that Cato ought to be placed at the very top of all, not even after the personage whom Apollo, as you say, judged the wisest in the world. For, after all, the man who won Apollos' praise is only honored for what he said, whereas we esteem Cato for what he did. But now to turn to myself. Let me tell you both the position, and I assure you that what I shall be saying is accurate. If I were to tell you Scipio's death caused me no sorrow, the philosophers could advise us whether this was the appropriate reaction, but at all the events it would certainly not be the truth. Of course I am upset. I have lost a friend, such as will never be seen again. Or so I must assume. For of this, at least, I am sure, there has never been a friend like him before. Yet I am not without a remedy all the same, for it is at least a comfort and a consolation that I am spared the delusion which causes most people to grieve when their friends have died. For I do not believe Scipio himself has suffered any misfortune. If anyone has suffered a misfortune, it is myself. But if you let your sorrows at such a happening overwhelm you, this shows how much you love, not your friend, but yourself. As for Scipio, on the other hand, surely everybody must agree that life treated him remarkably well, for unless he had conceived the idea of living forever, a thought which surely must have occurred to him, he fulfilled every ambition that anyone could justly pray for. When he was no more than a boy, his fellow countrymen already expected great things of his career, and while he was still a mere youth, his amazing gifts enabled him to satisfy these expectations, and even exceed them. Although he never offered himself for the consulship, he was elected consul not once, but twice, on the first occasion before the minimum legal age, and on the second occasion at the proper time, proper, that is, as far as he himself was concerned, but none too early for the safety of our country. By overthrowing 2 cities, the 2 deadliest foes of this empire of ours, he totally abolished war, not just now, but for the whole of time to come. His engaging manners, his devotion to his mother, his generosity to his sisters, his kindness to his relations, his fairness to one and all, I do not need to mention, because both of you have full knowledge of all these things. And as for the great love his fellow citizens bore for him, this was abundantly displayed by the lamentations at his funeral. So what could he have gained by living a few years longer? Even if old age is no burden, as I remember Cato arguing to Scipio and myself the year before he died, yet it does admittedly take away that vigorous freshness which Scipio never lost. So rich then in fortune and fame was his life, that there could have been no way of enriching it further. And so sudden was his death, that he never felt its sting. About the way he died, it is difficult to speak. You know, both of you, what people suspect. Yet one thing may be safely said. During his lifetime, he enjoyed many days of brilliant popularity and happiness. But the most notable of them all was that final day on which, after the Senate had finished its meetings, he was escorted home towards evening by a vast concourse of his fellow senators and the people of Rome, and our subject allies from all the regions of Italy and the Latins. So great a hero had he now become, that when he left us, his destination cannot surely have been the shades below. He must have been on his way to the gods above. For although some authorities have lately begun to argue that the soul perishes along with the body, so that everything is obliterated by death, I disagree with them. I prefer the more ancient view, which was held, among others, by our own ancestors. They used to pay meticulous reverence to the dead, which they would never have done had they believed that once a person is dead, nothing affects him any more. And other beliefs to the same effect were held by those inhabitants of our peninsula, whose principles and doctrines brought civilization to Greater Greece, a region which is ruined today, but was flourishing at that time. Besides, there was that man we were speaking of who, according to Apollo's oracle, surpassed the whole of the rest of the world in wisdom. When most topics were discussed, he liked to argue first on one side and then on the other. But on one subject, he maintained a consistent point of view. He declared that the human soul is divine. When it leaves the body, he believed, it has the power to take the road back to heaven, and the better and more decently it has behaved in life, the easier this road will be. That was also Scipio's opinion. A conversation he took part in only a very few days before his death seemed to show a presentiment of what was about to happen to him. Philus was there, and Manilius, and a number of others, and you and I, Scaevola, had gone together to join them. For 3 days, Scipio spoke about the condition of our country. And then, near the very end of his discourse, he turned to the immortality of the soul, repeating what, as he declared, the elder Africanus had told him in a dream. If it is true that when the best men die, their souls have a special opportunity to escape from the imprisoning confinement of the flesh, it would be impossible to think of anyone whose journey to heaven can have been easier than Scipio's. To utter lamentations, then, because of his death, would seem to me a proof of envy rather than friendship. If, on the other hand, the soul perishes at the same time as the body, and all sensation ceases to exist, then while it is true that there is nothing good in death, it is equally evident that it can have no bad results either. For if sensation has been lost, a man is exactly as if he had never been born, though the fact that Scipio was born brings us joy, and will never cease to bring joy to this land of ours as long as it remains in existence. And so I say once again that all has gone very well with him, but less well with myself. I entered life before he did, and it would have been more appropriate for me to depart from it first as well. Yet so happy are my recollections of our friendship that I feel convinced my life has been a good one, because I have spent it with Scipio. Both in our public and private lives, he and I have shared all the same interests. We lived in the same home. We soldiered together in the field. Our tastes and aims and views were identical, and that is where the essence of a friendship must always lie. As for my reputation for wisdom, which Fannius just mentioned, it is quite undeserved, and in any case it satisfies me less than the hope that my friendship with Scipio will go down to posterity. This is a hope which I cherish all the more keenly because, throughout the whole course of history, the pairs of friends who have been lastingly remembered only amount to barely 3, or 4 at the very most. It is my great desire that future generations will add the friendship of Scipio and Laelius to this small number. Fannius. That is a hope, Laelius, which will be fulfilled. There's no doubt about that. But you touched just now on the question of what friendship really means. Since we are free of public business at the moment, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor, and I know that I'm speaking for Scaevola as well. When people seek your views, whatever the topic may be. They always find you most obligingly ready to answer their queries. Now, will you please speak about friendship in the same way? Tell us how you would define it, and let us know the principles you consider it involves. Scaevola. Yes, do please talk to us on this subject. If you will, I shall be quite as delighted as Fannius. Indeed, when he asked you, I was just about to make the same request myself. So you would be doing us both a very great favor. Laelius. I should be willing enough to do as you say, if I felt in the slightest degree confident of saying anything worthwhile. The subject certainly is a splendid one, and as Fannius remarked, we have the spare time. But who am I to do such a thing, and what are my qualifications? The people who offer discourses of this kind tend to be scholars, and Greeks at that, speakers who claim the ability to deal with any subject you care to set before them without the slightest preparation. But that is a formidable thing to attempt, and needs a lot of practice. So if you want a comprehensive discussion about friendship, I advise you to apply not to me, but to the men who make a profession of such speeches. All I myself can do is to urge you to place friendship above every other human concern that can be imagined. Nothing else in the whole world is so completely in harmony with nature, and nothing so utterly right, in prosperity and adversity alike. But one point I particularly want to make is this. Friendship is only possible between good men. I do not propose to go into this aspect too meticulously, like those who argue at length that no one is good unless he is wise. That is all very subtle and may well be logically correct, but it possesses little relevance as a practical guide to living. Moreover, even if we concede that the people who put forward this view are right, the wisdom they have in mind is something which no mortal man has ever achieved. What you and I want to do, on the other hand, is not to look at such purely theoretical, imaginative aims, but at the actual possibilities of everyday life. Our ancestors admitted Gaius Fabricius, Manius Curius, and Titus Coroncanius into the category of wise men, but one could not claim that even they were wise by any such perfectionist standard as that. So much, then, for the name of wise man. It is an invidious and confusing definition anyway. The philosophers can keep it. All we shall ask them to concede is that those early Romans were good men. But even this they will refuse to admit, because of their insistence that no one can be good unless he is wise. All we ourselves can do, therefore, is to get on as best we can with the aid of our own dull wits. So let us take some individual whose life and behavior have displayed proven loyalty, honesty, fairness, and generosity, a man of unflinching integrity, like those whose names I just mentioned, someone whose character does not contain a trace of covetousness or violence or unscrupulousness, for such are the men who are generally described as good, and we are obliged to agree that they are entitled to the designation. They deserve it, because insofar as human beings can, they are acting in accordance with nature, which is the best possible guide to right living. For nature itself, I believe, was the creator of the ties that exist between one person and another. The closer the relationship, the more powerful the ties. Thus they are stronger between fellow citizens than between foreigners, stronger among relatives than among strangers. It is true that even between people who are foreign and strange to one another, nature encourages the development of a friendly feeling, but in such cases the sentiment lacks a solid basis. Real friendship is even more potent than kinship, for the latter may exist without goodwill, whereas friendship can do no such thing. You can see its unique power when you consider this point. The bonds which nature has established to link one member of the human race with another are innumerable, but friendship not only surpasses them all, but is something so choice and selective that its manifestations are normally restricted to two persons and two persons only, or at most extremely few. Friendship may be defined as a complete identity of feeling about all things in heaven and earth, an identity which is strengthened by mutual goodwill and affection. With the single exception of wisdom, I am inclined to regard it as the greatest of all the gifts the gods have bestowed upon mankind. Some people, I know, give preference to riches, or good health, or power, or public honors, and many rank sensuous pleasures highest of all. But feelings of that kind are something which any animal can experience, and the other items in that list, too, are thoroughly transient and uncertain. They do not hang on our own decisions at all, but are entirely at the mercy of fickle chance. Another school of thought believes that the supreme blessing is moral goodness, and this is the right view. Moreover, this is the quality to which friendship owes its entire origin and character. Without goodness, it cannot even exist. Let us follow the procedure we adopted before, and define goodness according to the usage of our daily life and speech. All those ideal measurements and grandiose phrases, which certain philosophers like to produce, can be left on one side altogether. If men are generally regarded as good, let us accept them as such. Paulus and Cato and Gaius and the younger Scipio and Philus and people like that. For all ordinary purposes, they amply meet the case. But as to those whose other hypothetical personages are not to be found anywhere in the world, we shall be well advised to forget all about them. Among individuals of the kind we are considering, the benefits that friendship offers almost defy description. They are so great. To begin with, how can life be worth living at all, to use the term of Ennius, unless it reposes on the mutual goodwill of friends? It is the most satisfying experience in the world to have someone you can speak to as freely as your own self about any and every subject upon earth. If things are going well, you cannot possibly enjoy your prosperity to the full unless you have another person whose pleasure equals your own. Should things go wrong, your misfortunes will indeed be hard to bear without someone who suffers as badly as yourself, or even worse. And so friendship is quite different from all the other things in the world on which we are accustomed to set our hearts. For each and every one of those other objectives is specifically adapted to some single purpose: riches to be spent, power to secure obedience, public office to win praise, pleasure to enjoy oneself, good health to be free from pain and make full use of one's bodily endowments. Friendship, on the other hand, serves a great host of different purposes, all at the same time. In whatever direction you turn, it still remains yours. No barrier can shut it out. It can never be untimely. It can never be in the way. We need friendship all the time, just as much as we need the proverbial prime necessities of life, fire and water. I'm not speaking of ordinary commonplace friendships, delightful and valuable though they can be. What I have in mind instead is the authentic, truly admirable sort of relationship, the sort that was embodied in those rare pairs of famous friends. Friendship, then, both adds a brighter glow to prosperity and relieves adversity by dividing and sharing the burden. And another of its very many and remarkable advantages is this: it is unique because of the bright rays of hope it projects into the future. It never allows the spirit to falter or fall. When a man thinks of a true friend, he is looking at himself in the mirror. Even when a friend is absent, he is present all the same. However poor he is rich. However weak, he is strong. And may I attempt to convey an even more difficult concept? Even when he is dead, he is still alive. He is alive because his friends still cherish him and remember him and long for him. This means that there is happiness even in his death. He ennobles the existence of those who are left behind. Take away the bond of kindly feeling from the world, and no house or city can stand. Even the fields will no longer be cultivated. If that sounds an exaggeration, consider the converse situation. Note the disasters that come from dissension and enmity. When there is internal hatred and division, no home or country in the world is strong enough to avoid destruction. That shows the value of the opposite situation, friendship. A certain learned man of Agrigentum is said to have composed an inspired Greek poem in which he sang that all things in nature and the universe, whether stationary or moving, are united by friendship, and discord is what pulls them apart. Here, at least, is something said by a philosopher which no one can fail to appreciate and approve. That is why, when an instance arises of someone incurring or sharing danger on behalf of a friend, the act is welcomed by the rest of the world with superlative praise. For example, when my guest and friend Marcus Pacuvius produced his recent play, one incident earned loud applause from the entire audience. This was the scene in which the king was confronted by two men and did not know which of them was Orestes. Pylades claimed that he was Orestes, in order that he should be the one to be put to death in the place of his friend. The real Orestes, however, continued to insist on his own true identity. The entire crowd stood and cheered, although it was only a play. You can imagine how they would have felt if it had happened in real life. Here, then, was a case of nature asserting its power. People were applauding in others what they had not been given an opportunity to achieve for themselves. Well, that is what I have to tell you about my views on friendship. If more remains to be said, and I have no doubt that it does, you had better ask the people who are used to conducting this sort of discussion. Fannius. No, you are the person we want to ask. I have often had occasion to interrogate the professionals you mention, and it was pleasant enough to hear what they had to say, but your approach to the subject is quite different from theirs, and wholly distinctive. Scaevola. You would stress that point even more, Fannius, if you had been at Scipio's country house the other day when they were discussing state affairs. Laelius spoke magnificently in defense of the idea of justice, while Philus produced elaborate arguments to the contrary. Fannius. Laelius cannot have found it very difficult to stand up for justice, since no one displays the quality better than himself. Scaevola. Yes, and that means he ought to find it easy to speak in favor of friendship as well, since that too is something he has put into practice with outstanding loyalty, perseverance, and fairness. And we all know the great admiration he has earned by doing so. Laelius. This really is coercion. Your tactful choice of weapons does not change the situation at all. Whatever may be said about your methods, they are violent, and when one's sons-in-law really press one for something, especially in a worthwhile cause, it is by no means easy to resist them. Indeed, I suppose one ought not even to try. I have thought a lot about friendship, and the more I think about it, the stronger my feeling is that the important question one has to decide is this. Does the fact that people need friendship mean there is some weakness and deficiency in themselves? If so, this would mean that their main purpose in acquiring friends is to exchange services with another person, that is to say, to give and receive benefits which it would be beyond their own individual powers to grant or obtain on their own account. But surely this giving and receiving constitutes merely one feature and consequence of friendship. As for its origins, do these not rather lie in something altogether more primeval and noble, something emanating more directly from the actual processes of nature? For goodwill is established by love, quite independently of any calculation of profit. And it is from love, amor, that the word for friendship, amicitia, is derived. It is true that you do often find people extracting advantages from someone by pretending they are his friends. The reason they are courting him so deferentially is because they are after some immediate benefit. But when there is real friendship, no element of falsity or pretense can possibly enter into the matter. Friendship simply cannot help being genuine and sincere all through. And that is why one is obliged to conclude that it must be a product of nature rather than of any deficiency. It cannot under any circumstances be derived from any calculation of potential profit. It comes from a feeling of affection, an inclination of the heart. The nature of this feeling can be deduced from the behavior of certain types of animal. These, it is easy to see, love their offspring up to a certain age and are loved by them in return. In the case of human beings, the same process is far more evident still. It is demonstrated by the mutual love existing between parents and their children, which nothing except the most outrageous crimes can possibly destroy. And the same sort of affection sometimes arises when we find a person whose habits and character attract us so much that we look upon him as a shining light of goodness and excellence. Goodness exercises an altogether exceptional appeal and incentive towards the establishment of affection. People who possess this quality can inspire love in us, even if we have never set eyes on them. When we think of Gaius Fabricius and Manius Curius, the hearts of all of us grow warm, although they lived long before our time. Equally, everyone detests Tarquinius Superbus and Spurius Cassius and Spurius Maelius. And then there were the two individuals against whom we fought for the supremacy of Italy, Pyrrhus and Hannibal. Towards the former, we did not feel particularly hostile, since he was a good man. The latter, on the other hand, will always be hated by Romans because of his cruelty. Goodness, then, is such a powerful thing that we love it even in people we have never seen, and, more remarkable still, even in those who have been our enemies in war. Since that is the situation, it is scarcely surprising that our spirits are stirred when we believe we discern virtue and excellence in people who are really available for us to form an intimate association with. These feelings are naturally intensified if we receive kind treatment from someone, for that means they like us. Another source of friendly feeling is to see a lot of someone in one's daily life. Add all these factors to the original friendly impulse, and the result will be a truly splendid and substantial glow of affection. Anyone of the opinion that this feeling emanates from mere inadequacy and is entirely concerned with getting hold of someone who will provide us with things that we should like to get is surely assigning friendship altogether too humble and ignoble in origin. For it really cannot just be the child of poverty and destitution. If it were, the less confidence a man felt in himself, the better his qualifications for friendship would have to be regarded. But that is far from being the case. Indeed, the contrary is true. The more confidence a person feels in himself, the stronger his equipment of moral and intellectual gifts will be. And although these are qualities that relieve him of dependence upon others and make him feel completely self-sufficient, they will actually strengthen his capacity for making and keeping friends. Consider Africanus, for example. Did he need me? Of course he did not. Nor, for that matter, did I need him. I was attached to him because I admired his fine qualities, and he returned my feeling because he also, on his side, appeared not to have formed too bad an opinion of my own character. And as we got to know one another better, our mutual affection grew. Certainly the association did bring practical advantages, and on a considerable scale. But in the formation of our friendship, no expectations of such a kind played even the slightest part. When a man shows kindness and generosity, his motive in doing so is not just to exact repayment. We do not hire out our favors and charge interest for them. We behave kindly because that is the natural thing to do. The reason why we count friendship as a blessing is not because we are hoping for a material return. It is because the union is quite enough profit in itself. These views will be vigorously repudiated by anyone who prefers to measure everything in animal-like terms of pleasure. That is not surprising, for when people are prepared to debase their whole standard of thinking to such a lowly and degraded level as that, any kind of lofty vision reaching up to the skies is obviously beyond their powers. So let us not bother to think about that category of individual at all. We shall do better, I repeat, to conclude that our feelings of attachment and affection towards our fellow human beings represent a wholly natural phenomenon, and that they are stimulated by evidence of superior character in the other person. And so, when two people have formed a taste for such qualities, this common inclination draws them together and unites them with one another. Next, association with the object of their love causes them to enjoy the company and character of the person in question, to reciprocate his devotion, and to desire to perform services on his behalf without demanding any for oneself in return. Two people in such a situation will become rivals, will compete with one another in the noblest way. That is how we can get the most out of a friendship. The fact that it has been founded on the processes of nature and does not rely on human defects will make it all the sounder and more genuine. If advantage were what kept friendships together, the removal of that advantage would mean that the friendship itself would cease to exist. But since instead nature is the originator, and since nature is everlasting, authentic friendship is permanent too. That, then, is what I think about how friendships come into being. Do you want to make any comments? Fannius. No, Laelius, do please go on, and since Scaevola is younger than myself, I am entitled to speak for him as well. And so on both our accounts, I ask you to continue. Scaevola. Fannius is quite right, Laelius. Please let us hear everything else that you have to say to us. Laelius. In that case, my dear friends, I shall tell you the points that used to come up on the numerous occasions when I was discussing this subject with Scipio. He maintained that it was the most difficult thing in the world for a friendship to last until the very end of life. Either it ceases to be mutually advantageous, or people's political views change and affect their relations with one another. And another thing that changes, he added, is a person's character. It gets altered by the blows of misfortune or the increasing burdens of age. He illustrated this point by comparing what happens to people in the early years of their lives. When boys discard the dress of childhood, at the same time they often throw off their friendships, however strong these may have been before. Or else, even if they manage to maintain these associations into early manhood, they frequently break them off at that point, because the two youths then find themselves competing for a wife or some other acquisition, which can only go to one or the other partner, but cannot go to both at the same time. Indeed, even if their friendship does succeed in lasting longer, it is likely to be ruined as soon as rivalry for public office begins. Among the majority of the population, on the other hand, friendship's worst destroyer is greed for money. But in men at the top, competitive ambition for jobs and distinctions is what causes the deadliest enmities, even between those who have been the most intimate friends hitherto. Scipio also expressed the view that many friendships are violently, and often quite rightly, broken when one party has asked the other to do something that is wrong, perhaps to help him gratify his vices, or to take part in some other equally deplorable act. When the demand, however justifiably, is rejected, the person who has been rebuffed claims that the laws of friendship have been flouted, and those other individuals who would be prepared to ask anything of a friend take the opportunity to hint that even if they themselves are importunate, this is only a sign that they would be prepared to do anything whatsoever for a friend's sake. The recriminations which go on and on after an incident of this kind are very often apt to put a stop to friendships, and indeed, they produce lasting enmities. Such, said Scipio, are the varied and perilous fates which hang over the relations between friends. To avoid every one of them requires the greatest wisdom and a good deal of luck. Evidently, then, it is necessary to consider just how far a man ought to be ready to go on behalf of his friends. If Coriolanus, for example, had friends, was it their duty to stay at his side even when he took up arms against his own country? Or should the friends of Spurius Cassius and Maelius have supported them in their attempts to become tyrants of Rome? As for Tiberius Gracchus, when he was disturbing the government, we saw how Quintus Tubero and other friends of his own age completely abandoned him. On the other hand, Gaius Blossius of Cumae, who enjoyed the hospitality of your family, Scaevola, came to me to plead for leniency. I was an advisor of the consuls Laenas and Rupilius. He justified this request on the grounds of his devotion to Tiberius Gracchus. He himself thought so highly of Gracchus said Blosius, that he felt obliged to do whatever his friend required. Even, I asked, if Gracchus had told you to set fire to the Capitol? He would never have wanted any such thing, but if he had wanted it, I should have obeyed. What an abominable thing to say! And heaven knows, Blosius acted in accordance with his professions, and even worse. Not content with merely following Gracchus's outrageous schemes, he actually directed them. He was not just his comrade, but took the lead in the whole frenzied enterprise. And when this lunacy resulted in the establishment of a court of inquiry, Blosius took flight and fled to the province of Asia, where he joined the enemies of our country and paid a heavy and richly deserved penalty for the crimes he had committed against the Roman state. To claim, then, that one did wrong for the sake of a friend is no excuse. After all, what had originally brought the two of you together was a mutual belief in each other's goodness. So if subsequently you stop being good, it is hard to see how the friendship can continue. If we decided it was right either to grant our friends everything they wanted, or to extract from them everything we wanted ourselves, this could only be harmless if we were persons of supreme and flawless wisdom. But the friends I now have in mind are the ones whom we ourselves actually see before our eyes and come across, or whom we at least know from hearsay. Men, that is to say, who belong to the realities of everyday life. For after all, those are the people we are obliged to take our models from. Perfect wisdom, of course, they have not attained, though we are entitled to select those who approach that ideal most closely. Thus we see, for example, or rather we have learnt from our fathers, that Aemilius Pappus enjoyed a great friendship with Gaius Fabricius, that they were twice colleagues in the consulship, and that they served together as censors. Manius Curius and Tiberius Coruncanius, too, according to tradition, were very closely associated, not only with the two I have just mentioned, but with each other as well. Now, when we think of men of that sort of caliber, it is surely quite impossible for us to suspect that any of them could possibly have asked a friend for anything conflicting with his honor, or with an oath he had taken, or with the interests of the nation. And if they themselves had received such demands, to suggest in the case of persons like these that the demands would have met with refusal is so obvious as not to be worth mentioning. For they were all men of the utmost integrity, who would have regarded it as equally wrong to have granted such a request, if they had received it, or to have made the request themselves. Tiberius Gracchus, on the other hand, does not come into this category. He was perfectly well able to find people prepared to pursue his designs, men such as Gaius Carbo and Gaius Cato, and his own brother Gaius Gracchus, too, although he was by no means enthusiastic at the time, has become a fanatical supporter of the same policy now. So this is the rule we must lay down between friends. Do not ask for anything that is wrong, and if you are asked for such a thing, turn the application down. To excuse oneself for committing a misdemeanor on the grounds that it was done for the sake of a friend is entirely unacceptable. Such an excuse is no justification for any offense whatever, and least of all for offenses against our country. For as both of you, Fannius and Scaevola, are well aware, our present situation requires us to keep the sharpest lookout for national crises that may be impending. The political traditions established by former generations of Romans have already been deflected quite strongly off their track and course. Tiberius Gracchus tried to give himself the power of a king. In fact, for a few months he was virtually king. The people of Rome had never heard or seen anything like it before. Moreover, even after he was dead, his friends and relatives continued along the path on which he had led the way. What they did to Publius Scipio, it brings tears to my eyes even to mention. As for Carbo, we have put up with him as best we can because, after all, his leader, Tiberius Gracchus, got his punishment, and not so long ago. But what is to be expected when Gaius Gracchus becomes tribune in his turn, I should not care to forecast. The trouble seeps down further every day, and once this sort of deterioration has started, it gains momentum rapidly, and soon there is a headlong rush to disaster. You can see how the decisions about the ballot taken even before the Gracchian disturbances ever began, first the Gabinian law and then 2 years later the Cassian law, have had their ruinous consequences. As I see it, the assembly has now broken completely with the Senate, and major policy is settled by the whim of the masses. What we shall find before long is that more people understand how to become agitators than understand how to stop them. The relevance of these happenings to our present discussion is this. No one goes in for such activities unless he has found associates. So every right-thinking man has to get this into his mind. If inadvertently, by any chance, he should have contrived to involve himself in friendships of such an extremely perilous nature, He must under no circumstances let that debar him from abandoning any of these friends once the man in question has committed some treasonable offense. Wrongdoers have to be punished, and the punishment will be just as severe for the followers as the leaders. Let Themistocles be an object lesson. He was the most famous and powerful man in the whole of Greece, and by leading his fellow countrymen in the Persian War, he had saved them all from slavery. Subsequently, however, he became unpopular and was driven into exile. He should have endured what his ungrateful compatriots were doing to him, unfair though it was. But that he refused to do. Instead, he acted as Coriolanus had acted, here at Rome, 20 years earlier. Both these individuals rose against their own compatriots. They were unable, however, to find anyone to help them, and so each in turn took his own life. An alliance with malefactors, which is what Themistocles and Coriolanus had become, could not be excused by any plea of friendship. On the contrary, such an association has to be penalized with the greatest severity, so that no one may be misguided enough to imagine that he would be right to support a friend who is making war upon his own country. And yet, the way matters are going now at Rome, I am very much afraid that this is just the sort of thing which is likely to happen here once again one of these days. Already at this very moment, the existing state of the Republic fills me with the deepest anxiety. But I also feel just as anxious, terribly anxious, about its fortunes in the future when I am dead and gone. So among the rules of friendship, this ought to come first of all. Never ask your friends for anything that is not right, and never do anything for them yourself unless it is right. But then, do it without even waiting to be asked. Always be ready to help, never hang back. Offer advice, too, willingly, and without hesitation. Just as you yourself, if you have a friend whose advice is good, should always pay great attention to what he says. But when you yourself are the advisor, use your influence as a friend to speak frankly, and even, if the occasion demands, severely. And if you are the recipient of equally stern advice, listen to it and act as you are advised. I have heard of some strange views held in Greece by individuals who are respected over there as wise men, I understand, though this sort of character is generally inclined to be over-subtle. I refer to suggestions from certain quarters that intimate friendships ought not to be indulged in at all, so that no one will have the slightest need to trouble himself with any other person at all. Everyone, according to this hypothesis, has more than enough worries of his own, and it is tiresome to get too deeply involved in those of others. The best thing, therefore, is to keep the reins of friendship as loose as you can, and then you can tighten them or relax them further as you please. For the essence of a happy life, the argument continues, is freedom from care, which no one can achieve if he has the worries of a lot of his fellow citizens on his hands. There is also, I am told, another view, which is even more heartless. I briefly touched on it just now. This is the assertion that friendships should be cultivated not for the sake of kindly and affectionate feeling at all, but solely for purposes of mutual utility. This would mean that the people who would get the most out of friendship would be those whose wills and bodies are the weakest. Helpless women would need its protection more than men, the poor more than the rich, the unfortunate more than those who are considered fortunate. What a peculiar philosophy! People who propound this sort of theory seem to me to be doing nothing less than tearing the very sun out of the heavens, for they are, in fact, depriving life of friendship, which is the noblest and most delightful of all the gifts the gods have given to mankind. And in any case, what does such freedom from care really mean? Superficially it looks attractive, but in reality there are many circumstances in which this is the very last thing we want. For there could, in fact, be nothing more misguided than to refuse to perform a good act, or having embarked on it to stop in the middle, merely in order to keep out of trouble. Certainly we may succeed in avoiding trouble, but at the same time we shall be avoiding decent behavior, because that is always bound to produce a certain amount of trouble because of its determination to eliminate everything that is incompatible with itself. When kindness, for example, rejects unkindness, self-control spurns license, courage throws out cowardice. For obviously the people who hate injustice more than anyone else are the just, the keenest opponents of cowardice are the brave, those most hostile to shameful behavior are the virtuous. Naturally, every person whose mind works in the right way welcomes what is good and grieves at what is bad. In other words, a wise man cannot possibly escape having any feelings of distress whatsoever, unless every trace of humanity has first been rooted out from his heart. Consequently, to remove friendship from our lives, just because it might bring us worries, would be the biggest possible mistake. For if we eliminate all human emotions, there is no difference left. I will not say between men and animals, because animals have their feelings, but even between men and tree trunks, or stones, or any other inanimate object you like to mention. And to anyone who maintains that the way to be good is to possess the hardness of iron, we should turn a deaf ear. In many aspects of life, and particularly in matters of friendship, Goodness is a sensitive and pliable thing. It is like a liquid reacting to heat and cold. When our friends are doing well, it expands with them, and when their affairs go badly, it shrinks in sympathy. Friendship, as I have just admitted, will inevitably involve distress, and quite often at that. But we simply must not let this prospect banish friendship out of our lives altogether, any more than we should be justified in rejecting moral standards because they too entail worries and troubles. Friendships, I repeat, are formed when an exemplar of shining goodness makes itself manifest, and when some congenial spirit feels the desire to fasten on to this model. Then the result will be affection. And if we allow ourselves, as we do, to be pleased by a whole host of meaningless things such as public office and fame and fine architecture and rich clothing and personal adornment, it would be ridiculous when we encounter a noble living being who possesses a capacity for loving, not to be wholly delighted with what we have found and to reciprocate his affection. Certainly it is very agreeable indeed to be able to perform the practical tasks of repaying kindness and exchanging friendly services, but it still remains true that the greatest of all possible incentives to friendship is congeniality of temperament. This means that a good man is attracted by other good men. He wants to annex them for themselves. This is almost like an ordinance of nature, as if the two of them were bound together by ties of blood. For nature has a greedy urge towards everything that is in conformity with itself. That, Fannius and Scaevola, is a cogent and evident reason, in my opinion, why good men feel for one another the kindly inclinations which nature has made the very wellspring of friendship. And these noble feelings are found in perfectly ordinary people. There is nothing inhuman or uncooperative or standoffish about goodness. It protects whole nations and looks after them extremely well, which it could certainly never do if it disdained the affectionate feelings of the man in the street. Anyone who wants to allege that a friendship is formed for the sake of advantage seems to me to be doing away with the most attractive things such an association can offer. What we enjoy in a friend is not the profit we derive from him, but the affection. Any practical benefit that goes with this affection only gives satisfaction when it is the product of a warm heart. It is quite untrue to say that people only form friendships because there is some deficiency in themselves. On the contrary, the most generous and liberal friends are those who have the very least need of anyone else, because they themselves already possess wealth and power, and above all goodness, which is the strongest resource a man can command. And in any case, perhaps it is rather frustrating if one's friends do not lack anything at all. If Scipio, for example, in his civil and military occupations, had never needed any advice or assistance from myself, it would have meant that I had no opportunity to show how fond of him I was. However, friendship does not develop out of advantage. The process works the other way around. If people whose lives are just constant wallowings in self-indulgence want to discuss friendship, let us not pay them the slightest attention. They do not understand the subject, either in practice or in theory, because heaven knows, surely we all ought to know, that there is not a man upon the whole earth who would want to live surrounded by unlimited wealth and affluence if the price he had to pay was to renounce both loving and being loved. That is how a tyrant lives, without mutual trust, without affection, without any assurance of enduring goodwill. In such a life, suspicion and anxiety reign everywhere, and friendship has no place. For no one can love the person he fears, or the person he believes himself to be feared by. Tyrants are courted, naturally, but the courting is insincere, and it only lasts for a time. When these despots fall, as they normally do, it becomes very evident how short of friends they have been. Tradition reports that Tarquinius Superbus made this point as he went into exile. At last, he said, it is clear to me which of my friends are true and which are false, now that I am no longer in a position to pay them back. Tarquinius, however, was an arrogant bully, and I doubt if he was able to have any friends at all. His character must surely have made this impossible, and in any case friendships are generally ruled out when there is an excess of resources and power. Fortune is not only blind herself, but blinds the people she has embraced. They become puffed up with disagreeable insolence, and there is nothing more insufferable than a fool whom fortune has blessed. You can see how military command and power and success transform people who had been decent enough before and cause them to discard their old friendships in favor of new ones. When a man is overflowing with wealth and goods in all kinds of abundance, and has got hold of everything that money can buy, horses, slaves, splendid clothes, expensive plate, he will be very foolish if he fails to add friends to that list, since they are the finest equipment that life can offer. Besides, when it is material property that people are acquiring, they have no idea who is really going to benefit from these goods in the end. They cannot guess on whose behalf ultimately they have gone to all this bother. For possessions of this kind get passed on, They go to the next man, whose turn it is to rise to the top. Friendship, on the other hand, remains a firm and durable asset. Indeed, even if a man does manage to keep his hands on fortune's transitory gifts, his life will still remain unhappy if it is empty and devoid of friends. So much, then, for this side of the matter, for it remains to make up our minds what limits and restrictions ought to be set to our affection for a friend. I know of 3 separate answers to this question, and I do not approve of any of them. The first opinion is that our feeling for friends should be identical with our feeling for our own selves. The second is that our goodwill towards friends should correspond in every respect to their own attitude towards us. The third point of view is that the value we attach to our friends should be exactly the same as the value they attach to themselves. Now, as I said, I disagree with every one of these pronouncements. The first of them, suggesting that a man should have the same feelings for his friends as he does for himself, is entirely wrong. We do a great many things for our friends that we should never dream of doing for others, or rather for ourselves. We are prepared on their behalf to ask and even to beg favors from the most inferior individuals. We are also ready to attack other people in savage, relentless terms, which would be odious if we were launching these onslaughts in our own interests, but are entirely respectable if their motive is to help a friend. And decent men are often willing to throw away or let themselves be deprived of substantial gain with the deliberate intention that the profit should go to their friends instead of to themselves. The second attitude, which restricts friendship to an equal interchange of services and feelings, reduces it to a too mean and narrow calculation of payments and receipts meticulously balanced. Friendship, to me, is something altogether richer and more abundant. It is not going to keep a close watch on whether it pays out more than it receives. Fears that something may slip over the side, or fall onto the ground, or overflow the proper measure of friendship are completely out of place. But the third limitation is the worst of all. This is the theory that a man's friends ought to estimate him at his own valuation of himself. A lot of people happen to be too humble about themselves, or too pessimistic about the possibility of self-betterment. In such cases, it is by no means the duty of a friend to accept the other man's estimate of himself. What he ought to do, on the contrary, is to exert every effort to increase his friend's self-confidence and lead him towards a more hopeful and optimistic opinion of his own capabilities. Evidently, then, these are all unacceptable definitions of friendship, and we must think of something else. But first I must mention one other standpoint which Scipio used to regard with particular distaste. This was the belief that we ought to love as if we are one day going to hate. Scipio said he regarded this idea as totally incompatible with true friendship. He refused to credit the generally accepted belief that the maxim was attributable to Bias, who was considered to be one of the 7 wise men. Scipio preferred instead to suppose that the utterance had emanated from some degraded character, perhaps an unscrupulous politician who was looking at everything in terms of his own career. For how could you possibly form a friendship with a man whom you foresaw all the time as a future enemy? If that were really your approach, you would inevitably find yourself hoping and praying that your friend would do wrong on every possible occasion. And if, on the contrary, he acted creditably and fared well, you would be obliged to feel pain, distress, and envy. So whoever it may be who originally made this statement, its effect is assuredly to consign friendship to destruction. The right view, in fact, is the exact opposite. We ought to have it instilled in us that we must never make a friend whom we might someday come to hate. And if, Scipio maintained, we prove mistaken in our choice of a friend, we have just got to put up with it. Under no circumstances must we look for an occasion to convert the relationship into a hostile one. So we still have not found the right way to define friendship. My suggestion is this. When 2 men of sound character are friends, they should unreservedly share all their concerns and aims with one another. Indeed, even if by some chance a friend of ours possessed ambitions which, while not entirely laudable, nevertheless needed our assistance, since either his life or his reputation were at stake, then we should have some justification in turning aside from the path of strict moral rectitude, short, that is to say, of doing something absolutely disgraceful, since there are limits beyond which friendship could not excusably go. I mentioned a danger to the man's reputation as well as his life, because one is entitled to consider this side of things, and recollect that, in a public career, the goodwill of one's fellow countrymen is an exceedingly powerful weapon. Certainly to acquire such goodwill by obsequious flattery would be wrong, but it is also entirely possible to gain popularity without the slightest departure from decent moral standards. But let me get back to Scipio, since he had a lot to say on the subject. He used to complain, for example, that people are prepared to take more trouble about everything else in the world than about friendship. Everyone has an idea how many goats and sheep he owns, but nobody can say how many friends he possesses. And an immense amount of care is devoted to acquiring the cattle, but none, Scipio believed, to choosing friends. And no one has at his disposal any definite signs or criteria for determining which candidate satisfies the necessary conditions for friendship and which does not. The friends we select ought to be sound and stable and reliable, but such people are distinctly scarce, and besides, it is extremely difficult to pick them except by practical experience. And the problem is that this experience can only be acquired after the friendship has actually begun. That is to say, the friendship comes first, and the material for estimating its desirability only becomes accessible later on. It is impossible to try one's friend out in advance. Any sensible person, then, will behave like a charioteer applying the reins to his team, and will check the vigorous impulses of his affections. In this way, he will be able, to some extent at least, to subject his friends to the same sort of preliminary testing operation that men apply to their horses. For example, one fault which may turn up in one's friends is unreliability in small money matters, whereas another sort of person would never succumb to corruption by a trivial sum, but shows himself a bad friend as soon as more imposing amounts are involved. There are some people, it is true, who would agree that it is always sordid to rate financial considerations above friendship. But we should be hard put to it to find anyone at all who would not be prepared to sacrifice a friend to his political or military career. Place the lucrative attractions of office on one side and the claims of friendship on the other, and far too often the former will easily come first. For human nature is too weak to refrain from coveting power. And indeed, even when a person has sunk so low as to abandon his friends in the effort to become powerful, he will still somehow manage to convince himself that a veil will be drawn over the defection, because it was prompted by such an irresistible motive. Consequently, men engaged in politics and the business of the state discover that true friendships are extremely hard to come by. For where on earth are you going to find anybody who will be keener to advance his friend's career than his own? Besides, if someone in public life gets into difficulties, people find it deeply disagreeable and painful to remain friends with him. Those who are prepared to step down and join him in his trouble are very few indeed. As Ennius rightly said, a friend in need is a friend indeed. There are two opposite charges on which most men stand convicted of fickleness and unreliability. When they are doing well, they forget their friends, and when a friend is in difficulties, they desert him. Anyone who proves himself a serious, reliable, and steadfast friend in both these sorts of circumstances clearly belongs to an extremely rare and indeed almost superhuman class of person. The foundation of this reliable steadfastness, which we look for in friends, is trust. Trust and friendship go together. We require our chosen friend to be straightforward and companionable and congenial. In other words, we hope that he will have the same interests as ourselves, and that is what makes for trust. No one with a devious or tortuous disposition inspires confidence, and no one who fails to share one's own concerns, who lacks sympathy with them, can really be trustworthy or reliable as a friend. I must add one further requirement, too. A true friend will not enjoy criticizing you, and, what is more, when other people criticize you, he will refuse to listen. Both these points are extremely relevant to this question of reliability, all of which is to repeat what I asserted at the beginning. Only good men have the capacity to be good friends. And so when good men, which means the same as wise men, enter into a friendship, they conduct it according to two rules. First, there must not be the slightest element of pretense or hypocrisy. Any decent person would rather hate openly than conceal his true thoughts behind an insincere expression. And not only, if there is criticism of his friend, will he take no notice, but he himself will never believe or entertain the slightest suspicion that the other person has done wrong. Secondly, a friend should be pleasant in conversation and manner, since these are things which add spice to any relationship. To be solemn and austere on all occasions may be impressive, but friendship ought to be something freer and more relaxed and more agreeable, paying greater attention to pleasant and amiable behavior. At this point, there arises a bit of a problem. Should new friends, assuming they deserve the designation, sometimes be ranked above old ones, in the same way as we prefer young horses to old? However, this is not a question which any human being really ought to ask. There are some things we can easily have too much of, but friendship is not one of them. The older it is, the better it ought to have become, like a wine that has improved with age. There is nothing in the saying that men must eat many a peck of salt together before they can know what friendship really means. I am not saying that new friendships are to be despised, on the assumption that they really offer a prospect of bearing fruit, like blades of corn that fulfill their promise at the harvest. Yet the old friendships must still keep their place, for length of time and familiarity are by no means negligible factors. To go back to horses for a moment, other things being equal, everyone would prefer to use the mount he knows rather than an untrained and unfamiliar one. Indeed, habit applies equally strongly to our attitudes, even towards inanimate objects. A place in which we have spent a long time, for example, arouses our affection, however rocky and wild it may be. A particularly important point between one friend and another is this. The superior must place himself on an equality with his inferior. It often happens that one man stands out among the others, as Scipio stood out in what you might call our group. All the same, he never had the slightest desire to place himself above Philus or Rupilius or Mummius, or even his other friends of lower rank. And his brother, Quintus Maximus, a distinguished man, but by no means Scipio's equal, actually received deference from him, because Quintus was the older of the two. Indeed, Scipio's greatest wish was that all his friends should gain, not lose, in stature because of their association with himself. And that is the lead which everyone should follow. If an individual happens to be superior in character or intellectual qualities or worldly wealth, it is his duty to pass on this advantage to his kinsmen and friends, thus making sure that the people who are closest to him have their share. If, for instance, his parents were of humble birth, it is up to him to improve their status and social position. And if his relatives are his inferiors in ability or wealth, he should provide them with material assistance. It is something like the situation in the myths when someone has been obliged for a time to live a menial existence because his origin and lineage were unknown. Finally, he is discovered and recognized to be the son of a god or a king, but still he retains affection for the shepherds whom he believed for many years to be his parents. And when there is an important personage in real life, when his humble parents are authentic parents, his feeling for them ought to be a great deal stronger still. For whatever gifts of mind and character we may possess, we only reap their finest fruits when we are able to share them with our nearest and dearest. So much then for the necessity that in any relationship with friends or kinsmen, the stronger partner must place himself on an equal footing with the weaker. And the latter, on their side, ought not to be distressed because the other man surpasses them in talents or possessions or rank. In reality, when such a situation arises, the weaker parties frequently indulge in complaints and reproaches. This is particularly apt to happen when they believe that they claim to have performed some friendly service to the other person, involving a certain amount of exertion. But this sort of individual who makes a grievance out of what he has done to help someone is thoroughly tedious. Certainly the man for whose sake the services have been performed ought to remember them, but the individual who performed them would do better to keep his mouth shut. To sum up, then, not only should the superior partner in a friendship reduce himself to the level of his friend, but he is also under an obligation to do everything he can to lift the friend to his own level. Some people make friendships very unpleasant because they are so ready to believe that they have been slighted. However, the characters who adopt this attitude are usually those who have a strong suspicion that they have deserved the slight. It is as well to disabuse them, and not merely by disclaimers either, but by practical demonstration. That is to say, you ought to give each of your friends just as much assistance as you have the capacity to provide, and as the object of your affection and assistance is capable of receiving. For however distinguished you may be, it would be beyond your powers to promote every one of your friends to the highest posts in the state. Scipio, for example, was able to get Publius Rupilius made consul, but then for his brother Lucius he could not manage it. And indeed, even if you did possess the power to give your friends everything you wanted him to have, it would still be incumbent on you to consider how far his capabilities extended. Generally speaking, decisions about friendship should be taken after we have reached full physical and intellectual maturity. Suppose that a person was keen on hunting and ball games as a boy. It is not to be expected that when he grows up, he will continue to associate with the individuals who in those early days had shared his interests. If that was the principle we adopted, our nurses and the slaves who took us to school would have a claim on the major part of our goodwill, because they were the first human beings we ever knew. We must not drop them, of course, but our relationships with them will now have to be looked at in a different light. Friendships formed before one grows up cannot possibly be stable or permanent, for young people's personalities change, and their tastes change with them, and altered tastes are what bring friendships to an end. The reason why bad men cannot be friends with good, and good men with bad, is because of the enormous gulf of character and tastes that yawns between them. And there is another useful rule. Do not let your good intentions towards a friend become so exaggerated that by mistake you actually damage his major interests instead of helping them. This happens all too often. For example, to borrow another illustration from mythology, if Neoptolemus had listened to Lycomedes, who had brought him up, he would never have taken Troy, since the old man had tearfully endeavored to prevent him from leaving home. Important business often makes it necessary for friends to part, and anyone who tries to prevent this because the separation will cause him unhappiness is displaying a weak, soft character and behaving unreasonably as a friend. All the time you have got to consider how much you are going to demand of your friend, and how much you yourself are going to give him. And now I must leave the relationships between men to whom some degree of wisdom may be attributed, because I want to descend to associations of a more everyday character. Breaking off a friendship can amount to a disaster, though the step may well be unavoidable all the same. It is possible for a person's faults, on occasion, to erupt unpleasantly on top of his friends, either directly or with a third party as the cause. When this occurs, the friendship needs to be brought to an end, not suddenly, but by a gradual process of elimination. Or, as I once heard Cato put the point, it is better to unstitch the union than to tear it apart, unless, that is to say, there has been some outburst of intolerable wrongdoing, in which case the only proper and honorable course, indeed the only practicable course, will be immediate withdrawal and dissociation. If, on the other hand, as more frequently happens, there has merely been a shift in attitude and interests, or a divergence of political views, for as I said, I am now talking about ordinary relationships, not those between exceptional men, then something must be done to make it clear that what has happened is just a termination of friendship and not a declaration of war. For if a man has been your friend, it is the most discreditable thing in the world to let him become your enemy. As you both know, Scipio stopped being a friend of Quintus Pompeius on my own account. Scipio was also compelled, again by a political difference, to become estranged from my colleague Quintus Metellus. In each instance he acted with dignity and restraint, and refused to allow his displeasure to deteriorate into bitterness. Our first duty, then, is to ensure that, if possible, our friendships shall contain no rifts. But if these nevertheless occur, it is our duty to make it look as though the associations have just burnt themselves out and not been forcibly smothered. Under no circumstances must friendships be allowed to deteriorate into serious hostility, which would inevitably mean that one becomes the target for insulting, abusive criticism. And yet even this hostile comment, provided it does not become absolutely intolerable, may have to be endured. For the friendship that once used to exist is still entitled to this degree of respect. You ought to be readier to suffer offense than to cause it. Against all these faults and troubles, there is only one possible precaution and safeguard. That is, do not be too quick to form an attachment. Make quite sure, first, that you are not attaching yourself to someone who does not deserve the association. The people who merit your friendship are those who genuinely possess some characteristic capable of inspiring devotion. Such men are rare, for of course it is the hardest thing in the world to find anything, in any field, that is altogether perfect of its kind. Most people are not prepared in their daily lives to accept that anything can be good unless it is a source of profit. They choose their best friends as they choose their cattle, lavishing the greatest affection where they hope for the most lucrative results. But if this is what they are going to do, they will miss the finest and most natural sort of friendship. I mean the sort which is desirable for its own sake and for itself. Such people deprive themselves of the opportunity to experience for themselves how powerful, how wonderful, and how all-embracing this kind of relationship can be. Think of the love any person feels for his own self. Why does he engage in all this self-love? Not from any hope of profit, but simply because it is in the nature of things that he should do so. Now, this is just the sort of feeling that has to be transferred to friendship. There is no other way to find a real friend. Birds and fishes and the beasts of the field, tame and wild, every living being loves itself. The feeling is inborn in every creature. And inborn, too, is the need to find other creatures of the same species onto which they can fasten themselves. The urge that impels them to do so bears some resemblance to human love, and indeed human nature engenders the same pair of feelings, with a special degree of intensity. For they too love themselves, and they too search for a partner whose personality they can unite so utterly with their own that the two are almost transformed into one. Perversely, not to say shamelessly, most people want to have the sort of friend they cannot be themselves. They expect their friends to provide what they themselves are incapable of supplying. However, the ideal requirement for such a relationship, next to being a good man yourself, is quite the opposite. It is to find someone not different from oneself, but the same. That is the best guarantee of the permanence I have been discussing. And those too are the circumstances in which men, united by mutual sympathy, can learn to master the passions to which other men are slaves. They will take pleasure in fairness and justice. There is nothing they will not do for one another. They will be incapable of asking their partner for anything that is not right and good. And besides loving and cherishing each other, they will also feel mutual respect. Remove respect from friendship, and you have taken away the most splendid ornament it possesses. People who believe friendship gives a good opportunity for all sorts of laxity and crime are making a dangerous mistake. That is not why nature gave us this blessing. She did not give it in order to pander to our vices, but to help us behave decently. For the highest standards of behavior are impossible to realize on one's own. Union with someone else, companionship, are the only things that can ensure them. Such an association, whether you are speaking of today or of the past, or of any epoch in the future, ranks as the finest and most glorious of all possible connections, embodying the highest good that nature has to offer. For friendships of such a kind embrace everything worth pursuing by mankind: goodness and fame, and peace of mind and satisfaction, the things which make life happy when we have them, whereas without them there can be no question of happiness at all. This happiness is the summit of our best ambitions. But if we are to get it, we shall have to concentrate on raising our behavior to the very highest standard that morality can achieve. If we fail to do this, we can achieve neither friendship nor, for that matter, any other worthwhile objective. Anyone who ignores these standards, but imagines that he has friends all the same, will discover his mistake as soon as some serious emergency obliges him to put their friendship to the test. Consequently, my warning needs to be repeated again and again. Become devoted to your friend only after you have tried him out. Do not first become devoted and then try him out. There is nothing which causes people to display worse carelessness and pay graver penalties than their selection and acquisition of friends. We are apt to plan, too late, for something that is already in the past. We start doing what has already been done, just the thing that the old proverb tells us to avoid. And then very often, after we have become involved with someone by meeting them every day, or doing each other good turns, all at once, right in the middle of our friendship, some cause of offense arises, and we break the whole thing off. Negligence of this magnitude, in so utterly vital a matter, is singularly deplorable. For, after all, the only thing in the whole of human life which everyone, without exception, agrees to be worthwhile is friendship. Even moral goodness is disparaged by a lot of people, who call it self-advertisement and display. And quite a number of people look down on riches because they themselves happen to need very little and are content with meager food and a modest way of life. Or then again, if you consider the attractions of an important political career, although some men, it is true, are consumed with such ambitions, a lot of others contemptuously regard it as something utterly empty and futile. The same applies to anything else you might like to mention. Whatever it may be, its admirers will be matched by many others who think nothing of it at all. Yet, friendship is something which inspires the same opinion in everybody: politicians, scholars who devote themselves to study and learning, businessmen who stick to their own affairs and keep out of public life. Even those individuals who devote themselves entirely to the pleasures of the flesh feel the same. All these categories of person, if they feel the slightest aspirations towards a decent human existence, believe that without friendship, life does not deserve the name. Somehow or other, friendship inserts itself into all our existences. However we choose to live, there is no escaping it. Picture someone who is by nature so savage and forbidding that he shuns and detests the company of his fellow men. Tradition tells us that there once lived just such an individual at Athens, called Timon, and yet even that sort of character would not be able to resist making contact with some other person, for at least he could not help wanting to find a target for his venomous bitterness. You can appreciate what I mean if you imagine the following situation. Suppose that some divine being lifted us out of the crowded human society in which we live, and planted us in some spot where nobody lived at all. Suppose, furthermore, that he supplied us with an abundance of every material provision which we could conceivably require, but made it utterly impossible for us to look upon any other human being. To put up with life on those terms would be beyond anyone's powers, even if you were made of iron. If you are lonely, every pleasure loses its savor. There was a famous saying which some sage always had on his lips. Archytas of Tarentum, I think it was. I have heard it repeated by old men at Rome, and they in turn had heard it from their seniors. The saying went like this: if a man ascended into heaven and gazed upon the whole workings of the universe and the beauty of the stars, The marvelous sight would give him no joy if he had to keep it to himself. And yet, if only there had been someone to describe the spectacle to, it would have filled him with delight. Nature abhors solitude, and always demands that everything should have some support to rely upon. For any human being, the best support of all is a good friend. Nature provides many a sign to let us know what she wants and seeks and demands. And yet, somehow or other, we turn a deaf ear and fail to listen to her warnings. The maintenance of a friendship is a varied and complex process, offering many perilous opportunities for suspicion and offense. If a man is wise, he will sometimes contrive to avoid these unpleasant occurrences, and will sometimes manage to make light of them. At other times, he just has to put up with them. Indeed, if we are going to preserve the value and sincerity of a friendship, there is one such cause of offense that has simply got to be endured. That is to say, you are under an obligation not only to advise your friend frequently, but to rebuke him if necessary. And when this is done to yourself, and done in a spirit of goodwill, you must take it in good part. Unfortunately, however, there is also a good deal of truth in what my friend Terence said in his Women of Andros. Flattery gets us friends, but truth earns ill will. Certainly truth of that kind can be very disagreeable, since it does indeed produce ill will, and ill will is what poisons friendships. But flattery is in fact much the more tiresome disadvantage of the two, because while it indulges a friend's misdeeds, it is also contributing to his ruin. And most culpable of all is the friend who spurns the truth and allows flattery to seduce him into doing wrong. This whole matter requires rational and discreet handling. Advice must not be harsh or criticism offensive. If we are going to flatter, to use Terence's word, let it be just a form of courtesy, entirely free of any servile elements, since servility is what aids and abets every sort of viciousness, and is unworthy not only of a friend, but of any free man at all. Life with a friend is not like life with a tyrant. A man whose ears are so completely closed to the truth that he cannot even hear it from a friend is a hopeless case. Cato spoke shrewdly, as so often, when he remarked, "In some ways our worst enemies do us greater services than our friends who seem so agreeable," since enemies often tell us the truth, whereas friends never do. Certainly it is irrational, if you are criticized, not to feel annoyed when you hear something that warrants annoyance, but to feel furious about a remark which ought not to upset you at all. You are annoyed not because you have done wrong, but because you are blamed for it, whereas what you ought to be feeling sorry about is the wrong you have done, and when it is corrected, you ought to be glad. So it is an essential feature of genuine friendship, both to offer advice and to receive it. The advice should be given frankly, but not harshly, and received with patience and no trace of resentment. There can be no worse blot on a friendship than fawning sycophancy and adulation. Call this by whatever name you like. It can only be branded as a vice, characteristic of unreliable, insincere men who like to speak in a fashion calculated to give pleasure, without the slightest regard for the truth. Hypocrisy is bound to be vicious, because it saps and contaminates our standards of truthfulness. And this makes it wholly incompatible with friendship, which must be truthful if it is to have any meaning at all. The significance of friendship is that it unites human hearts, but this cannot happen if one of the personalities involved fails to remain consistently the same and instead takes on a variety of shifting and changeable forms. For it is impossible to imagine anything more devious and tortuous than an individual who is prepared to transform his own personality in obedience, not only to someone else's feelings and opinions, but even to the very expression on the other person's face. He says no, and I say no. He says yes, and I say yes. In other words, I have made it my duty to agree with him in everything. That is Terence again, but now he is speaking in the character of Gnatho, the sort of man whom nobody but a fool would want. There are a great many people about who, even if they are Gnatho's superiors in positions and wealth and reputation, behave exactly like him all the same. And when you have a man who is not only insincere, but influential, this sycophancy becomes really dangerous. However, if you are careful, it is possible to tell a hypocritical friend from a real one. You can keep the two sorts apart, in the same way as you can distinguish any other sham or fake from the authentic original. A public meeting consists of wholly inexperienced people, and yet, when gathered together, they can usually tell the difference between a demagogue, that is to say, a politician of the smooth-tongued, unreliable sort, and a statesman who is reliable and truthful and honest. A short time ago, Gaius Papirius Carbo insinuated himself into the favor of the assembly by proposing a law to make tribunes of the people eligible for re-election to a second term of office. I spoke against him. But never mind about me. It is Scipio I want to talk about. Heavens, what an impressive, imposing speech he made. You might have thought he was the head of the whole Roman state, not just one private citizen among many. However, you were both there listening to him, and in any case his speech is available for all to read. As a result of his words, the bill in question, which was meant to please the people, was turned down. The people themselves turned it down. To return to myself, you must remember when Scipio's brother Quintus Fabius Maximus and Lucius Hostilius Moncinus were consuls, how popular Gaius Crassus's bill about priestly appointments seemed likely to be. Such appointments had previously been arranged by cooptation, and it was now proposed to transfer them, together with all the immense patronage they carried, to the popular vote. Crassus also made another democratic gesture. He was the first man who ever turned to face the forum while addressing the assembly. I was called upon to speak in reply, and it turned out that his specious arguments could be defeated quite easily. What I did was to appeal to the reverence we all feel towards the immortal gods. These events took place while I was only praetor. I did not become consul for another 5 years. In other words, what won the debate was not influence derived from rank, but the merits of the case itself. On the stage, then, for that is what those public meetings amount to, the ample opportunities that exist for lies and misrepresentations still cannot prevent truth from winning the day, once it is revealed and brought out into the light. How much more, then, must this apply to friendship, of which truth is the indispensable condition? Between friends, unless the other person bears his soul to you, and you bear yours to him, there can be no question of loyalty and certainty, or, for that matter, of loving and being loved, since concealment would make it quite impossible to estimate whether there is any genuine feeling at all. Just now I was speaking of those who flatter their friends. Disastrous though this practice is, it can only do real harm to someone who enjoys receiving the flattery. For anyone who listens readily to sycophants makes himself a victim of self-love and complacency. Now, here is an apparent analogy with genuine goodness or virtue, because that quality, too, shares this capacity for loving itself, for it knows itself best, and in consequence it apprehends that it is worthy of love. But people who enjoy being flattered are not really after virtue at all, but merely the outward semblance of virtue. For a lot of people are less concerned to be virtuous than to look it. Such are the individuals who enjoy listening to flattery, and when they hear talk calculated to please them, they regard the empty phrases as clear demonstrations of what models of perfection they must be. But a friendship in which one particular partner does not want to hear the truth, and the other is prepared to tell lies, can only be utterly meaningless. When we are watching a comedy on the stage, it is true we find the servility of the parasites amusing instead of disgusting, but that is because the dramatist relieves it with the contrasting humor of that other stock type, the swaggering soldier. "Did Tice really seem grateful for my present?" asks one of the warriors. It would have been enough to answer, "Yes, very grateful." But the parasite prefers to reply, "Gigantically grateful." If the person who is being flattered wants something to be large, a sycophant always makes it larger still. Now, when people welcome and encourage this kind of obsequiousness, it has its effect on them. And even tougher, better balanced characters need to be warned that they must defend themselves vigilantly against the craftier forms of servile behavior. If someone goes in for servility of the most open kind, nobody but a downright fool will fall for it. But what we must be on our guard against is letting the subtle, secret operator worm his way behind our defenses. He is hard to recognize, because he often conceals his flattery beneath the appearance of offering opposition. That is to say, he pretends to disagree, but finally pays the other person the compliment of giving in and allowing himself to be defeated, thus creating the impression that his companion had been more far-sighted than himself. To allow oneself to be made a fool of in such a way is shameful. We must take precautions against such a thing happening to ourselves. "Today you have tricked me," said the character in a comedy, "and made a wise fool of me, and made a worse fool of me than all the old fools of the comic stage." For in plays, too, the silliest characters are always the old men, who have so little sense that they always believe everything they are told. But somehow or other, I have drifted away from my theme. What I had proposed to talk about was friendship between good men, that is to say, wise men, Wise, I mean, according to practical human standards. But instead, I have started discussing friendships of a more trivial nature. So let me now return to my original subject, and finally bring the matter to a conclusion. What unites friends in the first place, Fannius and Scaevola, and what keeps them friends, is goodness of character. All harmony and permanence and fidelity come from that. When this moral quality appears and reveals its brilliant light, and perceives and recognizes the same illumination in another person, it is impelled in his direction and receives his radiant beams. And that is how love or friendship comes into existence. Both words, amor and amicitia, come from amare, to love. And love is precisely the nature of the affection you feel for your friend. Certainly does not require the prompting of any advantage. Advantage does, it is true, grow out of friendship, whether you have intentionally pursued such a benefit or not, but that is another matter. This was the sort of affection which I myself, when I was young, felt towards certain men who were already quite old, Lucius Paulus, Marcus Cato, Gaius Sulpicius Gallus, Publius Nasica, and the elder Tiberius Gracchus, the father-in-law of my friend Scipio. But the feeling shines brightest when it is shared by persons of the same age, like Scipio, Lucius Furius Filus, Publius Rupilius, Spurius Mummius, and myself. However, now that I myself am old, I enjoy my friendships with young people such as yourselves and Quintus Aelius Tubero. I also greatly appreciate my friendly relations with very young men like Publius Rutilius Rufus and Aulus Verginius. And yet, all the same, life and human nature being what they are, with a new generation always coming up, the most satisfying thing of all, really, is to reach the end of the race with the same companions who were with you at the starting post. Since everything that is mortal is precarious and transient, we ought always to go on and on searching for people who can receive our love and be loved by us in return. Without affection and kindly feeling, life can hold no joys. Scipio was suddenly snatched away, but for me, he is still living and always will be. What I loved him for was his goodness, and this is something that has not died. When he was alive, it was always with me, and the vision remains with me still. Indeed, every generation to come, for all eternity, will continue to be illuminated by the glory and renown of his noble character. All men, forevermore, who have the courage and hope to embark on great enterprises, will be certain to cherish in their hearts the memory and example of that man. As for myself, not one of the good things that fortune or nature has bestowed on me could begin to compare with my friendship with Scipio. One of its features was the total harmony between us on matters of state. Another aspect was the advice he was always prepared to give me about all my private affairs, and our leisure hours together were a source of unfailing pleasure. To the best of my knowledge, I never caused him irritation, and he never once addressed to me a single word I would have preferred unsaid. We shared the same house, we ate the same meals, and we ate them side by side. Together we were soldiers, together we traveled, together we went for our country holidays. Every minute of our spare time, as you know, we devoted to study and research, withdrawn from the eyes of the world, but enjoying the company of one another. If my recollection of all these doings had perished with Scipio when he died, the loss of my friend, who was so utterly close and dear to me, would be unendurable. But the picture of them in my mind has not passed away. My memory keeps the vision alive, and it becomes even more wonderful as time goes on. And besides, in any case, if I had lost the power to recall these things, my age would be some comfort, for it means that I shall not have to endure my bereavement for very long. Even the severest of burdens can be borne, provided their duration is short. That, then, is what I have to say about friendship. Now, no one can be a friend unless he is a good man, but next to goodness itself, I entreat you to regard friendship as the finest thing in all the world.